everybody for hopping on today. Matt Simmons, managing partner with Maxwell, Hendry and Simmons. We are a real estate appraisal and valuation consulting business located in Fort Myers. We serve pretty much all of Southwest Florida, though, doing residential and commercial valuation work. And a lot of kind of studies essentially relative to real estate problem solving issues. So with that, that's a little bit about me. Again, Morgan, thanks for the invite. Looking forward to answering some questions today.
Absolutely. And Brian Chapman Jr.
Yeah, Brian Chapman Jr., second generation insurance agent in town. My father's a State Farm agent. We have 5 locations, from Port Charlotte as our most northern location down to Bonita Beach Road, and then 3 in the middle there. We primarily focus on property and casualty insurance. So that's the wheels and the walls. If it has wheels or it has walls, that's what we look to insure. We cross both lines where we do personal lines insurance for residential, and we also do commercial and commercial residential, which is condos, HOAs, across pretty much South Sarasota down to Marco Island.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you both for being on and taking the time to go over some questions that we are all seeing after something that no one has seen in, a lifetime. And so basically, I know, Matt, you got to have some power washing going on. So I'll ask you the question first.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about, we're getting a lot of questions about this 50% rule. What does that mean?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because confusion over what it means is part of what is creating the issue right now. So 10,000 foot view, FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. Almost every community in the country participates in the program in order to have properties inside of their communities eligible for that program, for NFIP. In order to do that, though, you've got to comply with certain sets of rules and regulations that FEMA essentially promulgates through something called their Substantial Damage, Substantial Improvement Handbook. And that handbook is kind of what lays out, at least in terms of the 50% rule, some of the issues that come into play when you've got a property that either you're trying to improve, storm notwithstanding, or a property that's been damaged, when that property, and this is what's important, is located in a flood zone and it's non-conforming, which in this case, what we mean by that is that the finished floor level is beneath current base flood elevation requirements. So that's kind of what we mean when we say non-conforming in this sense. Now, part of what makes, so what that means is, if you've got a property and let's say it's worth $500,000, you can only spend in terms of improving a property through a remodel or something, or in this case, putting a property, back together post-storm. You can only spend up to 50% of what's called the structure value. So you go, okay, well, if my entire property is worth 500,000, how do I determine the structure value? That's where things start getting kind of confusing. Because while FEMA sets at the 10,000 foot level the requirements on structuring a program, it's the local municipalities that implement and essentially, local floodplain managers that control compliance with FEMA's 50% rule. And frankly, in normal circumstances, that's great. You would want a program to have enough flexibility that the local officials at the point essentially that is closest and most accountable to the people that are impacted, that they have flexibility. But in this case, it's created a little bit of confusion because everyone's having to get up to speed. And so, Fort Myers Beach maybe has a different set of requirements than unincorporated Lee County and City of Fort Myers and City of Sanibel. So that's part of what the issue is. And the differences have to do with not so much how the 50% is calculated. There is a number on the assessment side that you can point to as kind of a base number. That's a number that's lower than what the true structure value would be. but at least is some published number that if you're beneath that, you can kind of blow and go and, you know, get what you need done, and you don't need a private appraisal or some of these other methods. But where the challenge starts to come in is if a community has kind of a timing involved with, you know, when you can put 50% of that cost in, and if that's cumulative.
You're
We
having
lost
some
you, Matt.
issues. Yeah, you're having some issues with your internet there. Matt, we'll have to come back to you.
Just on what Matt was talking about there, with regard to the communities, I mean, so there's 5 participating communities in Lee County alone. Each community, so just because you think of a county as a community, it actually breaks down into subset communities, and then each one of those communities, like in Lee County, we have 5. They have their own community number, and so those 5 communities. Then within those communities, we each have our own like city ordinance requirements. So, you know, the complexity of the structure value, and I think he was getting ready to get there, is if it's greater than that 50% number, then that's where you have to bring that current structure up to code or up to compliance. And in many cases, that's bringing it up to the floodplain elevation. So if a home is sitting in 8 feet currently, and you cross that 50% rule, then they look at the requirement currently at 11 feet today, then that home has to be elevated to that 11 feet. And basically you're starting over with that house. And that's why the 50% rule is relatively scary. Now, I will tell you, the conversations that I've had outside of our with communities in the last 5 years that have dealt with this, it's a one at a time basis, one house at a time, right? And there are a lot of situations where there will be tremendous pressure on the building official to make that call. And from the conversations that I've had, there are situations where they run away from the bad press and just do what has to be done. So take it for what that's worth. But that is some of the discussions that I've had outside the area. Matt may have more to add to that too, with a community that's dealt with that 50% rule.
Are you seeing when this rule applies, that it's causing insurances to drop them?
Not necessarily, because the policy that's covering them is specifically the flood insurance. You know, they will make a payout, and then, you know, there's not like, because that's triggered doesn't mean they just drop the policy, right? So with regard to the flood insurance, no. Now with the home insurance, at some point, if you do have to comply with the 50% rule, which is potentially a demolition and rebuild, then the home insurance carrier doesn't have anything to insure there until you start that project. And then that would be in the form of builder's risk, which is kind of like home insurance, but it's really designed for insurance during the course of construction.
So, Matt and Brian, like, how many calls are you getting regarding this 50% rule, or questions of rebuild? Just so, I mean.
Do you have me back? Am I
Yes,
okay now?
yes.
Okay, good. So, I mean, I'll answer that one. We're getting it. It's nonstop. I mean, the phones have been ringing for 2 weeks now on that issue. And I saw, and again, I apologize, not sure where I cut off before, but I saw that somebody was asking about essentially, again, what the 50% rule is. So Brian, you know, I think covered some of it, but I'd started with an analogy of a $500,000 house.
Yeah, we got you, Matt. Like maybe you were like 85% of the way there. You just broke up at the end.
Okay. So if a property's worth $500,000, obviously the land is a component that has to come out of that number. There's also, say, site improvements like, you know, landscaping, or maybe like a detached building or a pool or something, or patio, things that aren't part of the principal structure that's non-conforming. So essentially stripping all that stuff away, you know, maybe that $500,000 property, there's $300,000 that can be attributed to that non-conforming structure. So that would mean that there's $150,000, 50% of work that can go into that property without triggering the 50% rule that Brian described that, you know, would require you to come into conformance with base flood elevation requirements.
So do you have an elementary version of all that?
So no, unfortunately, no, and that's part of what makes it a little bit complicated. I mean, the truth is, a lot of the phone calls we're getting right now, we can kind of explain things on an individual basis and pull up someone's property card if they give us a ring, and we're always happy to do that, to tell them, okay, from a default standpoint, if you go into permitting, here's the number they're going to give you. And what I also tell people is, again, the number that you're going to see there is much lower than what the structure value is worth, 99.9% of the time. And people will be frustrated because it's like, my structure is worth way more than that. And it's like, everybody knows that it is. That, you know, the purpose of the assessment has nothing to do with market value. It's about just value for purposes of conformance with the statute that deals with, you know, taxing and assessment. But why it's still good to have that published number there, it doesn't hurt you, but it gives you some sort of point where you don't need any private appraisal at all. And so, like, think of it as just a starting point. Everyone knows that that number is not, you know, truly reflective of what the structure value is, but it gives those people a green light to go ahead and move forward. So if permitting has somebody come in, and again, that number is good enough for what you need, go with that number. You don't need to hire somebody like us. Then don't fool with it. So that's why there's at least, you know, it's good that there is some number that you can use as a starting point.
Awesome. So again, if anyone has any questions, probably best to call Matt and have an individual conversation, because it's based on, of course, each scenario. It's not always going to be the same.
Yeah, and I can at least describe to you, though, if you know, you're curious of where this is. You know, most people are familiar with the property appraiser's website. So if you go onto the property appraiser's site and you click on parcel details, so that's the landing page we're all used to. There's a section kind of on the left-hand side where it says like working values. And there's a little icon of a blue information button on top of like a graph with some numbers. It's just a little hyperlink, but that's what it looks like. If you click through to that, that's your property card. So you connect to your individual property card that actually has a whole lot more details on your property. Most people don't even know that that's there. It kind of gives you a peek behind the scenes, yeah, of a property. Up in the top right-hand corner then of the property card is something that's called, the term is a misnomer, but it's cost value is what it says. And that's basically just a depreciated cost for only one component of a value approach on your assessment. So again, don't worry about what it's based off of. It's just a number that permitting can use, that depreciated cost number. So that's specifically the number that is the default that we're talking about here. And that's how you get to it. And again, if you've got any questions, of course, anybody can reach me directly.
That's an amazing aha for me. I did not even know that existed.
Right. It's a little nugget of information there, a peek behind the scenes.
That's awesome. Well, now we're talking about percentage. So the next question that we have is coming to Brian, and so what does the 2% rule imply when it comes to the lanai? Sorry, when it comes to the lanai and the dwelling. So, you know, hurricane, that's a 2% deduction. But what does that mean? Because now we're getting questions from our insurance company of, well, I damaged to my lanai, but not the dwelling. And they're saying it's not covered, or it is covered, but only up to X. What is the difference?
So the insured value includes typically when we're talking about the 2% hurricane deductible, that's applying to your coverage A. Coverage A is your dwelling value. So if you look at your policy, look at the first line of coverage, it's called coverage A, and that's for That's for the structure itself or the dwelling limit itself. So then if you follow that down, there's additional coverages as well. Some might see like other structures or detached structures. That is for structures that are not tied directly to the dwelling. So they're floating on your property somewhere on your own. We could call this fences. We could call these sheds. Some people have, dog houses. Some people have barns. Those are detached structures. But really the way that the hurricane deductibles derived is off of the dwelling value. And if it's 2%, sometimes it's 5%. Some bold people have taken the option of 10%, not too many. But there is an option for it. So 2% would be 2% of the dwelling value. So if you have a home insured for $500,000, your deductible would be 2% of the $500,000. Remember, we're looking at the cost basis or the replacement cost basis. So that does not include the land value, the landscaping, the location of the property. We're just looking at what would it cost to replace this structure here. So in that situation, if you have a 2% deductible, you're going to have a $10,000 deductible before your coverage applies or pays you. Now, when it gets a little tricky is when we start looking at pool cages or lanais, because they are part of the structure. Some carriers include them in the coverage A, in the dwelling coverage, and some carriers exclude them, but you can buy it back. You can buy back the pool cage coverage. And then some carriers exclude pool cages and you cannot buy it back. So when you buy back the pool cage coverage, let's say it starts at $10,000. So if you bought back the pool cage coverage at $10,000, you're thinking, well, my deductible is $10,000. If that was the only thing that was damaged on your property, which is highly unlikely, but if that was the only thing damaged on your property, then yes, that would be a wash. That would meet your first 2%. But there are situations and in many cases, I'll go one more level here, make it a little more complex, where someone may have been only purchasing $10,000 in pool cage coverage, so that is their limit. But to replace that pool cage might cost $20,000. And so maybe they accidentally or intentionally underinsured that pool cage. The way that the insurance process works is they look at what is the true loss to you. Okay, so what is your real loss? And if the cost to replace that pool cage coverage is $20,000, then your real loss is $20,000, even though you're only covered for up to $10,000. And in that situation, what would happen is you'd have a 2% deductible, which would be the first $10,000, but then you have a net loss of $10,000, and they would pay you that $10,000 for your pool cage. If you think of it like the deductible being absorbed into the total loss, that's what happens in those cases. So the 2% is there. A lot of people think, do I have to pay the 2%? Do I have to like write a check for the 2%? It does not work that way. You would have an assessment done by your field adjuster. The total loss to your property would be calculated out onto a spreadsheet. They use Xactimate, most of the vendors, most of the carriers as a rule of thumb. That Xactimate number would then total to a number, and then you would deduct the hurricane off of that, and then you would get the balance of that. So a lot of people think that the deductible has to be paid, and it's not necessarily paid. It's just reduced by the claim amount.
And so when you talk about lanai, that is the cage, or does that encompass the lanai and pool?
Well, I mean, traditionally speaking, when someone says lanai, I think of just, you open your sliders and just have a screened-in lanai area, but no pool. Is that what you're looking at there?
Some of the, I mean, there's a lot of questions we've been getting. Pools are damaged because they have debris in them from all sorts of stuff. They have a boat in the pool, but I'm hearing that the pool is not covered.
Well, it could be not covered because remember, some carriers don't allow you to buy that back. And then Others allow you to buy it back. It starts at 10,000 and increases in $5,000 increments. So if you bought it back, I mean, the coverage is there. Just have to include your deductible.
And if they don't have it and their pool is damaged, they're just,
Basically, yeah, it's all excluded. I mean, this one is a, you know, probably the most fluid coverage on the policy. That's why there's complexity here, because some carriers include coverage for the aluminum and not the screens. And some carriers include coverage for the aluminum and the screens. So this coverage, you know, varies from the 60 or so homeowners carriers in the state on what they offer and how they offer it. So this one is kind of complex, but if somebody bought back pool cage coverage, they would at least have it up to that amount for the aluminum. Some carriers include the screen as well. If they didn't buy it back, then they would not have coverage. However, that loss still gets absorbed into the total loss, right? To the property, when I gave you that analogy of total loss to the dwelling. So.
and we're getting, this goes into the next question, and Matt, I'll go to you after this question. Is it the homeowner's responsibility to provide bids to the insurance or to the adjuster, and or how do we handle the adjuster?
I mean, I strongly recommend the homeowner to supply the bids, because whatever their software comes up with, they will usually give you the first offer, meaning the insurance company will say, this is what we're seeing. And typically in my experience, it doesn't include the inflationary level of what happens after a hurricane. And so you need to be prudent and get your own estimates. And, you know, I would say 2, if you can get 2, you know, 3 is great. You can get 2, you probably have enough. So send those over. And, you know, if they're relatively close, I would say pick the contractor you want from that point, as long as the carrier, you know, gives you the thumbs up on it. But I certainly, that's exactly what I'm doing. I mean, I'm sending over my estimates that I'm receiving for sliders and for fence that was damaged, and I'm sending those right over to my desk adjuster that I'm working with, and giving him more time right now than maybe most would be, just because I understand how busy they are with the number of claims that they're seeing. So this is a war of patience. The most patient person will win in the end. It's just going to take a little while to get there.
I love that. Oh, that's awesome. Well, all right. So we'll give you a rest, Brian, and I'm going to go back to Matt. So Matt, I think one of the other questions we had coming in is, I think you said the IRS publication 547. Oh, I'll have to unmute you. Maybe that helps too. Where are you on here? There you go.
Okay. I was thinking you didn't like what I had to say. So, okay. Yeah, so this is another little wrinkle that is worth looking into, particularly if you're in an area or know someone or have a client in an area that's been severely impacted. Sanibel, I actually think, might be a market where this ends up becoming most important. But at this point, again, it's something we should all be aware of because it may apply to many of us. Publication 547 from the IRS deals with casualty losses. And in a nutshell, you are allowed to, in a federally recognized disaster area, and the aftermath of, obviously in this case, a storm, if there is diminution or loss to your property value, you can take that loss as a direct offset to income, either in the year the disaster took place or in the year prior. So for a lot of folks who may have had some returns in 2021, that would be nice to offset. Maybe not so much this year, but for 2021, it's going to be a pretty impactful benefit. And so what that looks like is getting the property valued as of a date prior to the storm, which is actually the same thing that's done for 50% rule. in the aftermath of a hurricane. That's something I didn't cover, but you get the pre-storm structure value for purposes of, determining how much work you can put in. Obviously, if you were left with, the damaged property and could only do 50% of that, that wouldn't, make a lot of sense. But for a casualty loss or diminution loss consistent with those IRS regulations, you get pre-storm value versus post-storm value. And so let's say that prior to the storm, you had a property that was worth $1 million. And after the storm, you have a property that's worth $700,000. You've lost obviously $300,000 worth of value. Under certain circumstances, a whole bunch of caveats, and also the caveat of I'm not giving anybody individual advice on this, I'm steering them directly to their accountant or wealth advisor. You can use that $300,000 loss again as an offset to income. So it's a pretty big deal. I mean, $300,000 diminution, if you're in a 35% tax bracket, we're talking 6 figures in terms of the implication. Right. So it's a really big deal. There's a few wrinkles again with, is the loss associated with damage to property, or is it associated with changes in market conditions after a property? It can be both, but obviously compensation for insurance on the back end can start to blunt some of the benefit. But if you're not made whole by insurance, then obviously you've still not been made whole and you've suffered that loss. So again, this is truly one where there's a bunch of wrinkles to it. But if you're in an area, have suffered property damage, and particularly if you're in an area that the market has a little bit of a hiccup after the storm, then that's something you want to look at and speak to your accountant about. The one other little piece of it is if you are to, say, take a property, in our example, that is $1 million, and it goes down to 700,000, that also adjusts your basis. Now, what your basis going in is a factor of other elements, but it will reset your basis. So down the road, you could have a bigger gain that you're paying a tax on. But like all tax deferred strategies, I'd rather pay $1 of tax 10 years from now than today. And so I'll take the savings as an offset to today's income. Now, keeping in mind too, a lot of gains are never paid because depending on your estate plan, there's a stepped up basis. If your property is handed on to your heirs at the time of your passing. So realistically, reading between the lines, you may reset a basis and be saying, I'm not going to pay $1 of tax, I'll just pay it instead 10 years from now, but never actually paying that $1 of tax because your heirs get your stepped up basis in the property. So again, it's a really, really big deal for people who will be in a position to take advantage of that. And obviously people are suffering losses any number of ways after the storm. And so making them aware of this little wrinkle within the tax code is pretty important. And so with that, yeah.
And what is the name of this tax code again?
So publication 547 is the IRS's published document that addresses it. And that's the reference document that if you're curious about it, you should look into it. You're happy to call us, but again, I'll also tell you what I know, but I'll also then tell you, you got to talk to your accountant. So anyway, just, yeah, food for thought on that for people to look into.
And it brings up another question that I see. If the property is no longer there and taxes are coming up this end of, basically in a month, how is their property being, taxed if there's no dwelling on it anymore?
Yeah, for like property taxes.
Yeah, from, just, do you have any insight to that?
Yeah, so assessments each year are based off of January 1st of the given year. So as it relates to the trim notices we all received in August and the tax bills that correspond to those that are coming here within the next month, those bills are based off the value as of January 1st of 2022. So it's not relevant at the moment. On the assessment side, it's going to become quite relevant, obviously, for this upcoming year, because here, almost 2 months out from today, we'll be looking at another assessment date. And so the property appraiser in Lee County has already created a link on their website where if you have damage, you can go ahead and proactively make them aware of what's going on so that they can try to write down your assessment for this upcoming year. So that's as it relates to the assessment side. Now, what I'll tell you though about taxes is the governor issued an executive order last week where essentially tax bills for property tax this year and the affected areas, if you're an impacted property owner that had damage, everything is kind of backing up 2 months. So normally, you know, if you pay in November, you get the discount early. And then the bill is actually due like in April. All of that is backing up. So early, you still get full early payment discount if you pay not in November, but in January. And the final bill is actually due like in June. And there might be a couple other little wrinkles that are going to be added. The governor has hinted at least at potentially some level of deferment on a component of the taxes. That becomes difficult at the state level to navigate because obviously there's independent taxing districts that are getting their revenue based off of that. So what he said has been kind of measured, understandably. But I suspect that the special session that's coming up for the legislature shortly, that there's going to be some action on this and even more of a benefit than just the 2-year delay that he did through executive order this past week.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's very helpful and wow. So 2 months is the delay on the taxes, and also for your personal taxes too. They push that back. We won't go down that road. So Brian,
6 months. Yep, you've got a 6 months deferment on that, right?
Yep. So Brian, what all are you seeing too? I mean, obviously you're getting lots of calls on insurance. I think the other question we have is what companies are still going to be in business after all this? Like how do we know yet insurance is not going to go out of business and not have coverage?
Yeah, I mean, most of the companies, the majority of them will be fine through this entire hurricane. Now, doesn't mean that they'll be as good as they were, but the reason most of them will be fine is because, in an analogy, we're using those, but just to illustrate what happens here. So as you as a homeowner or condo unit owner buy a policy and that policy has a deductible, so do the insurance companies. So the insurance company buys an insurance policy that has a deductible, and they have to keep enough cash on hand to pay the initial claims and cover that deductible. But then after that deductible is triggered, then the real money that's paying for most of these claims is going to be reinsurance. And that's where the billions of dollars are going to come from. So the carriers themselves will do okay. Now they will be shaken and they will be rocked, but realistically, yes, there are going to be a handful that won't. They will not be able to navigate through this, but those companies were already on the rocks prior to the end. And, after the fourth quarter numbers come out, there'll probably be a few that, immediately go into liquidation. For most of those, the state of Florida will step in and secure the claims. But it's a merry-go-round. So, a carrier doesn't make it, they get, OIR issues an order to the chief financial officer. Chief financial officer, puts the carrier into liquidation status. Carrier goes into FIGA, which is the Florida Insurance Guarantee Association. The Florida Insurance Guarantee Association pays the claims, settles out, refunds premiums on those old policies. But that FIGA is funded by insurance policies. And if you've ever looked at your insurance policy, there's a fee on there. It's called the FIGA assessment. And so why I call it a merry-go-round is because when a carrier goes under, you don't get the opportunity just to look at your neighbor that had that carrier and say, I'm so sorry for you. Your neighbor gets to look back at you and say, and I'm sorry for you, because your policy that you buy for your house is going to have an increase in the assessment. Now, right now, it's not as devastating as what your neighbor's going to go through, but that assessment, was under 1%, and now it's creeping to 2%. And as these carriers go under, we will all be paying for the assessment, and it touches just about every single type of policy in the state of Florida, from your car insurance to your home insurance to your umbrella to your wave runners to your boats. Like, every single policy has a FIGA assessment fee on it. And so, it's kind of a hidden tax, so to speak, but it's a tax that funds the Florida Insurance Guarantee Association. So the domino effect will linger and will linger for multiple years as this progresses.
So, if speaking of that, if I were to buy a home today, what hoops do I have to go through to even get insurance? Because I hear there's a lot of extra layers added.
So the process is the same, right? The process is the same. The carriers that are interested are probably about 50% of what it was pre-Ian. So we got about 50% of our lineup, ready to take a policy. The additional steps in that process are pre-existing damage. And so now we're having to have some certification forms done prior to us binding the policy.
Wow.
So, wind mitt and 4-point, well, here comes the third form. It's going to be a modified version. It's basically a fitness test of the house. I'm sure there'll be some standardization that gets applied to this. Right now, it's kind of each carrier is doing their own form. But it basically is just a bill of health that certifies, things that the 4-point and the wind mitigation don't look at. And, a few more exterior photos for the carrier. Even with that, it feels pretty much the same. It's just that's going to be an additional form that we'll have to get done. And if there's a home that did not sustain significant damage, it's still very reasonable to get an insurance option put together. And that's loosening up as we get farther and farther with Ian in the rearview mirror. So, that will continue to be easier or become a little bit less difficult as the weeks and months unfold.
So is there anything else before we go back to Matt, you're seeing, from people that are on here are mainly homeowners that is crucial that they should know?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ian in a lot of ways did us a huge favor in an interesting way, because the governor immediately post-storm issued an executive order, and that executive order basically pauses all non-renewals in the state of Florida. And so anyone that had a potential to lose their policy in the future, that is not allowed at this moment. And the carriers have to basically rescind the non-renewal. So most of us on this phone call, probably 20% of us on this phone call, whether we knew it or not, we're probably going to be getting a non-renewal in the next 6 to 9 months. 20% of us on this call.
Oh, I don't like that.
So, well, that non-renewal was basically carriers shedding policies that they did not want to have. Like, they just looked at the cost for their reinsurance and said, these do not work. The numbers don't work for us. So they were non-renewing those policies. Not that anyone did anything wrong, but just that they didn't, the money in, money out without a claim, it wasn't profitable for them. So they were going through that process. We were dealing with about 400 a month at our office, of our existing clients being non-renewed, and we're having to then go find option B. And so all that is stopped, which is great. Now, the other benefit of the executive order, again, this doesn't help new transactions necessarily, right? This doesn't help the sale of real estate, but it does provide a lot of stability to the real estate marketplace with insurance. If you were in the path of Ian, and regardless in the path, if your home sustained any damage from Ian, until those repairs are made, your policy cannot be canceled or non-renewed. And then once the repairs are made, then the company has 90 days after that they can start the non-renewal process. And why this is important is because if you have damage on your house and it's not been repaired, then you can maintain your insurance policy, meaning the carrier cannot non-renew you just because they don't want to insure your house anymore, or they're scared, or whatever situation. They have to keep it. Now, that does not mean that the rate can't change. And so just because you have a policy, then we have the affordability conversation. But the important thing about that is it basically just froze some of the major disruptions in our marketplace with the non-renewals, and also people losing their policy and having to go find a new policy. And so, a lot of people in Southwest Florida are going to have unrepaired damage on the insurance side. Fortunately, that will allow them to keep their policy. And that will be conversations that we have with the carriers to say, hey, there's still unrepaired damage here. You cannot cancel this policy. You've got to keep it. So yeah, I see a question there, like, what if a claim is settled? No, it's just because the claim is settled doesn't mean there's unrepaired or finished repairing of damage, right? So that's the statute. If you read it, if there's unrepaired damage, then the homeowner policy from that carrier must stay in place until the damages are repaired. So we could be talking 3 years, right, for some of these unrepaired structures where the policy has to stay in place, which is a really good thing.
That is a good thing. And then the other question is, does it apply to commercial, the non-renewal?
It does not. Commercial has until November 28th. So commercial general property is what we refer to it as for, commercial buildings, November 28th. So if, we had policies that were non-renewing like October 20th, right? They were just set for non-renewal. The carrier has to maintain that till November 28th. Then the executive order is really designed for residential or personal. It does include commercial residential, which is high-rise, mid-rise, and condominium association. That's what we call commercial residential. So it does include that, but not commercial property.
Yeah, and one of your things was, I'll come back to you, Brian. I'll let you have a breather, get some water, and then I'm going to ask you about the condos next.
Okay.
So Matt, I know we talked about the 50% rule and the IRS 547. What else are you seeing that we need to know as homeowners? Oh, are you mute? Why do you keep? We just don't like you. Just kidding. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm causing it because I'm muting myself as they're literally power washing my windows. So I'm good at the moment. Yeah, I think just more broadly, those are the two specific wrinkles that are, directly storm related that we're trying to make sure everyone is aware of at the moment. A couple other dynamics in the market that I think are kind of interesting and at least worth thinking about are, because everyone's question, of course, is, market conditions, what's going to happen, what are we looking at? I think it's important to keep in mind that after storms, traditionally, the market has actually popped a little bit upward from a pricing standpoint. That may or may, we've never dealt with one here that has been to this magnitude, and maybe the market cycle is at a point where that just doesn't happen this way. But what's unique in a lot of disaster areas is, after a storm comes through, there is so much economic activity that has to take place and money that flows into the market from outside of market, that it typically creates a little bit of a run up in terms of, you've just got outside money coming in droves. and a tremendous amount of commerce that is compelled to take place. And so, not that you want to think about it this way or that it's healthy, but there's typically a little bit of a sugar high from an economic standpoint. So that's kind of one of the dynamics in the market that we're keeping an eye on. Something that we're extremely concerned about and are trying to work with some folks on solutions, but it's hard, is the affordable housing issue. And it's like, that was an issue pre-storm. Affordable housing has been a problem here for a long time, but we've had now a tremendous number of units come out of service. And a large number of those units were beach proximate, but were buildings that were older and smaller, and that, somebody could rent or have a roommate and, work at one of the restaurants on the beach, that kind of thing. Or were directly on the beach even. Kind of replacing and housing those folks is a nightmare at the moment. On top of all the folks who have dropped into this market to do the work that has to be done. I mean, there's guys sleeping in beds of pickup trucks all over the place at the moment, literally. And the hotels have obviously stepped up with some of the workers to try to house people temporarily. That's a natural fit. They're obviously not filled with tourists at the moment, but we're going to have a long-term issue with affordable housing that, again, we had prior to the storm, but there's going to be some real reckoning in terms of policy, in terms of how to house people in a way to fill the jobs that are necessary to accommodate the lifestyle that we all, love and enjoy in Southwest Florida.
That's an aspect that a lot of us don't think about. So I'm glad that you mentioned it, because again, some of us on the call still have a house to live in.
Sure.
Some on the call may not have a house, but that is very, very important. And Tatum has a question. Do we have an approximate number of available rental units in the market right now? Do you know? So
only anecdotal information. I mean, obviously the MLS, there's a rental component there. If it's so anemic right now, it's, almost not even worth mentioning. And frankly, the things that are listed are typically at a price that it's somebody who realizes, hey, I can, try to grab somebody at some outrageous rent. So I don't have a number on that. What I will say is interesting. I had just given a month and a half ago, Justin Thibault with LSI, he and I gave a presentation on affordable housing, all the metrics involved, the current inventory, all that stuff. And I don't think the data aged well. I'm not sure any of it's applicable anymore, but what I can say is that, again, it was so bad of an issue. We don't even have frictional vacancies. Like, there's nothing in terms of inventory that's available. The apartments are full. Again, hotels are housing temporary workers. So there's just a major fight right now for space. And there's honestly, in terms of a direct answer, there's literally nothing available for rent. Nothing that is advertised even close to a market rent rate. So there is none.
And I see it too from my end. And if I won the lotto, I would buy all the commercial buildings that are sitting empty for 2 years and make them affordability housing.
There's some folks that are doing that. There's a couple properties right now that they're not permitted for that. There's not a temporary place, but that is how they are in service at the moment. And to be honest, pretty much everybody is looking the other way too, because they know, yeah, if you got an empty, say, big box retail, you can pop 500-600 sleeping bags, and it's crews of guys who are working to try to rebuild the islands. So it's nuts. This is happening everywhere. If it doesn't, even when it doesn't meet the eye, there's some things happening places and some buildings right now that would shock people. That, again, everybody's just kind of, I didn't hear that, didn't see that. So,
well, this is recorded, so we didn't.
Right. Yeah.
There's one more question, then I'm gonna go to Brian. Are there any policy changes already in discussion regarding fast tracking zoning, permitting, incentives, et cetera, for affordable housing? I think we might have covered that, but that question just came in. For city or county. So that's on you, Matt.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was for Brian.
No, you're, this one's for you.
Okay.
Are there any policy changes already in discussion regarding fast tracking zoning, permitting, incentives, et cetera, for affordable housing with city or county?
Got it. Yeah, there's a couple of things that have been placed. Well, prior to the storm, there were some efforts in place to incentivize affordable housing. One of the proposals that at least is being talked about, and this is not something that I think any of the local municipalities would say is active policy in process. But what I would say is it's not as if the development community is unaware of the need for affordable housing. Like people will say, gosh, why doesn't somebody build there? There's a huge need. There's, why is everything luxury apartments? It's not as if people aren't aware that, yeah, there's a market for affordable units. The private sector would love to fill that need. I mean, it's obvious that it's there. You cannot create a pro forma on a project that can meet return thresholds that would either attract private investment or, for that matter, that could secure construction financing. Like the amount of money it costs to take a project all the way through and then have rents that are at an affordable level, you can't literally build those projects at times. So what we've been talking about and what others are talking about is essentially there are bonus density programs. Pretty much all of our municipalities have bonus density programs, but kind of putting those programs on steroids, so to speak, and saying that, there's no impact fees, for example, relative to affordable units. You don't have impact fees on those. There may be some level of tax abatement, some level of also fast tracking bonus density that you can get by right. Those are a few ways to do that, because the private sector would love to meet the need. They just can't at the moment. The only other little wrinkle I would say in terms of fast tracking permitting, we talked about the 50% rule already. The city of Cape Coral, there was an article I think Wink had on this. You can pull it up. They have asked folks to essentially wait, I think, until maybe December 1st or something like that, to start making repairs in Cape Coral. They're wrestling with how to conform with the 50% rule, is what that's all about. And I'm not advising people to either wait or not wait. But the reason they're trying to do this is they're, I believe, trying to amend their ordinance to get rid of the 5-year cumulative calculations for the 50% rule. So I know I mentioned that before, but what that means is if we've got that $500,000 property where $300,000 is associated with structure value, let's say that, 2 years ago, you spent $100,000 on a remodel. So you've already spent, if that structure value is $300,000 and you have $150,000 then to work with for the 50% rule, $100,000 of it you already exhausted 2 years ago. And so that means for 3 more years, you only got $50,000 left to work with.
Wow.
So that's how these cumulative things work with 50% rule. Local municipalities don't have to have that as a requirement. Like I believe the city of Sanibel's requirement is you can go in for a permit, do the work based off the 50% rule, close out that permit. Now what's the structure value? Walk over and get another application and go right back in again for another 50%. But some communities have this 5-year, phasing so that you can't, use your 50%, in less than 5 years. But they realize that right now, hey, we maybe need to drop that component. We have flexibility to drop it. Let's get rid of that so that people can do what they're doing. That's part of the conversation that's going on in Cape Coral right now. There's a couple, other municipalities that have that 5-year requirement and a few other wrinkles that at the moment they are trying to figure out how to get rid of those. And those conversations are happening. We've offered to help, in terms of helping with any of the policy choices, because we realize it is kind of a rat's nest of, in the weeds. How do you figure these things out? Nobody expected to be dealing with this. But those conversations are happening right now. People are trying to make changes.
That's very, very interesting. And good to know that people are trying to make changes to help everybody. And I did not know about the 5 years. So that's another thing I've learned today. It's awesome.
A lot of folks, unfortunately, right now are going in and finding out they bought that property 3 years ago. And the people who owned it 4 years ago, who did that remodel that they loved, exhausted the entirety of their 50%. Yeah. So you can imagine there's some really tricky situations people are trying to figure out at the moment.
Brett Ellis, make sure you make note of that one. See you on there. All right. Well, thank you. That's very, very interesting. And that's something that I think we need to talk more about, not today, but for us as real estate agents to help educate people that are hurting in Cape Coral.
Yep.
So Brian, there's a question that says, what about a seller selling a home with some damage that is unrepairable? Buyer wants to take over the repairs. How is that handled? Oh, you're muted. I gotta find you. There you are.
All right, one more time on that question.
Sure. A seller is selling their home with some damage that is unrepairable. Buyer wants to take over the repairs. How is that handled?
That definitely can happen. So one of the provisions in the policy allows for you to assign the benefits of the policy to the future buyer. The complexity is if that future buyer or that potential buyer is not a cash buyer, how are we going to insure a home with significant damage? There's a real issue here, right? So if it's significant damage, more than just like the pool cage, let's say the roof is not in a, let's say it's in a fair position, needs to be replaced. Yeah, not possible. It's not possible to find an insurance policy. So the benefits of the prior policy can be assigned to the new buyer, but the policy itself cannot be assigned to the new buyer. That's allowed for flood insurance, but not for the hazard insurance. So that's going to be a hurry up, get it fixed. Now there is some flexibility, but again, these are not systemized. They're not automatic. We have to get humans involved to say, hey, there is a roof permit and the roof is going to be replaced. But, given the timetables on how long it's going to take to replace, 50% of the roofs in Southwest Florida, I don't think most carriers are going to just, absolutely be like excited about that situation and wanting to insure that home. Now, if there's a few soffit, few gutters, roof's fine, the pool cage is down, but there's a temporary fence up, like a 4-foot fence up, that's potentially fun. We can probably find a policy for that. But I think the ones that are severely damaged, people are like, hey, I'm not rebuilding, I'm not redoing anything here. I just want to sell the property as is and roll out. That's going to require cash. If it's lender, then insurance is going to be difficult to place, probably almost impossible. The only thing that we possibly could do there, this is just putting this out there, it's not easy.
Hail Mary.
Is if it's significantly damaged, we can put a builder's risk in place, which is in the course of construction or renovation. When it's significant, there's not really a homeowner's carrier that covers a policy while the home is in the course of construction. We have to write a builder's risk policy for that. Contractors, developers are very familiar with this. If you've ever built a new home with a private builder, you're familiar with this. But we would put a builder's risk in place for the extensive renovations. The reason I say it's a little bit of a Hail Mary is because the undamaged portion of the house is going to be covered at a different valuation, which may not satisfy the lender requirements. So the undamaged portion of the house would not be covered at replacement cost, but at actual cash value, which is the depreciated value. And most lenders are not satisfied by that.
So if their home is significantly damaged and it was for sale, they might as well, if they can't accept a low offer or a cash offer price as is, they should follow a claim and stay put and get it repaired.
I mean, it's, yeah, get it repaired as fast as you can if your desire is to sell it. That gets you out of the fire sale situation and actually can sell something more for market value versus, now there are people that don't want to do that and they will sell and they'll take that first offer and they'll go. Usually the contractor or investor who's taking that risk is here for the long haul, right? To at least get the property to stability and then sell it. So.
But I guess my other question is, if they're selling it as is a fire sale, if they still want insurance, but they can't get it.
They can get liability insurance, but there's not an insurance company that's going to insure a structure with a hole in the roof. Like it's just not going to happen.
Got it. But so we're seeing a lot of those coming in right now. So that's why it's important to understand that difference.
Yeah, I mean, moderate pre-existing damage. We call it pre-existing damage. You have to understand these carriers that we're dealing with right now, pre-Ian, were not excited to be here, right? They're not excited to be here, and they were in the first 90 days they can get off of a policy for whatever reason. They don't like the smell of the air in the front door. I don't know, like whatever, they can get off of it, right? And so where we were pre-Ian was like, hey, this palm tree branch is touching the house. We're sending out a cancellation notice in the first 90 days. If they trim the palm tree, we'll reconsider it, maybe. Like that's what we were dealing with pre-Ian. Now we're talking about, soffit and insulation on the ground and shingles in the yard. And so, and the market didn't heal itself. So if they were concerned about a palm tree, they're certainly concerned about what they're looking at now. And so those homes, maybe if we call it like a third of the market space, they're gonna have to get fixed before they're gonna be insurable.
And one of the questions was, and this could be for both you and Matt. I think I have to unmute Matt too, but where do people go to? I mean, we all have our list of people that we trust that are contractors and, roofers, all that. But what do you advise people to go to find them?
Yeah, I mean, the resources of all those contractors in the first 24 hours, that local ones they were completed, right? They were at full capacity. Now they have brought in the workforce, I think that Matt was talking about. They have additional workforce that's come into the area through networks that they have with other roofing, businesses outside of our area. And so there are local and there are outside of our area roofers. I always caution the ones outside of our area. However, there are some A+ roofers from outside of our area that are here for a temporary time, and they will only be here for a couple years. But they do roofs nationally, right? So they have a contract with an assisted living facility, and they handle all of their assisted living facilities across the country. And they see this as an opportunity, so they come here, bring millions of dollars in inventory with them, and 50 to 100 guys with them, and they start to go out and re-roof our community. Some of those are fine. There are some of those that, man, you've got to be very, very, very careful, and just watch what you sign and watch who you're doing business with, because they will not be here when that roof fails in 2 or 3 or 4 years. And I remember this vividly after Charlie, where there was significant damage to a roof. The roof was replaced, and 2 years later, it's leaking. And it was just due to a lack of proper installation, right? The product wasn't failing, it was the installation of the product. So, yeah, I mean, the docks, they are, we've got Williamson Brothers, Stokes, Hickox. I mean, they were at 6 months, 5-6 months pre-EM, right? So now there has been some displacement, which could help us. If someone was primarily doing a local company doing Sanibel docks, well, they got displaced, so maybe they're in Fort Myers. And there's a Pine Island, a couple dock builders in Pine Island that are in Fort Myers right now. So they're kind of building. It's interesting. I see it as building the mainland first and then gravitating out towards the coast, because I think the work's quicker to begin here because of the streets and roads and accessibility. And then it will, kind of push to the islands, and there'll be some fragmenting that takes place. But, trusting those contractors is the most important thing. And having, call our office. We have a list that we've started creating because we're getting these questions all the time on roofers, electricians, plumbers, aluminum, pool cage. I mean, you name it, all the stuff on the outside that blew around like a kite. So we've started creating a list just of companies that we know or we're hearing good feedback about.
That's awesome. And so again, if you have any questions, please, that's Brian Chapman Jr. We'll send his number out to everybody, or we'll type it in the chat box. Same with Matt's. And Matt, if someone were to call your office, do you have a similar type of list?
So, I mean, we've had kind of a list internally for our staff. There's really not a list, though, that we've pushed externally. I think the resource that Brian provided there and his summary is solid advice. I would, if I'm looking for somebody, I would actually call Brian's office too in some cases. Let's go with that.
Yeah, I think I need your cage company.
Yeah,
That's for sure. So what other questions do you all have that are on right now, as we've, covered some of the big topics that have come into our offices? Is there something pressing that someone has? I have one I like to ask. Okay, Brett. Oh, you want me to unmute you? When I feel important? Let me unmute you.
mm-hmm.
There you go.
All right. Okay, so here's a question I think is going to happen a lot. I've got an older seller, fixed income, did not want to spend a dime, didn't have the money to prepay for any repairs. So he said to me, I want to take my flood insurance proceeds, sell the home. And I said, well, if you do that, it's going to be at a discount because the 32 inches of water got in the home. He says, I don't care. That's the only way I'm doing it. I found a buyer paying cash. They're accepting the home as is. They're letting him stay in the property for a period. He's living in the home. So this question is going to go to both of you. I'm selling it below market value cash. The new buyer knows the seller is keeping the flood insurance proceeds. The new buyer is then going to fix up the home and then go get insurance. They know there won't be insurance in the meantime. I was told by someone else that maybe that's insurance fraud. You're not allowed to do that. But they called their insurance adjuster, said you can absolutely do that. You can keep the proceeds. What do you guys take on that? Number one, Brian, and number two, Matt, how do we document that in MLS if that's a below market sale?
So the flood insurance, yeah, you can absolutely do that. Buyer's decision to reduce the cost based off of that. I think that we'll see many transactions happen in that same exact situation, Brett.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of that too. And as far as advice, Brett, in MLS, I'd say, within, I don't know if the property was on market previously, if there's already an MLS entry, but like some folks will do after the fact, inputting it, maybe in the property information line, putting at the beginning, hey, see confidential comments or something to raise a red flag of, hey, there's something unique here. Well, what I would say is, from my standpoint, I would want that information on the valuation side, just with the flag up here that, hey, obviously this is not a normal deal. And the reason that I would want it still recorded with that note is there's going to be some scenarios where we're going to have to figure out what discounts are taking place in the market for people who are pulling a trigger in that type of posture. And so knowing, for example, hey, okay, Brett had this sale, here was the discount. We can then say, here's where the market would be for that kind of property normally. And that gives us a frame of reference then to say, all right, we have a point where we can say, here's the discount associated with these types of deals. And then I would say on the buyer's end also, you know, they will get a letter from the property appraiser's office, like anyone gets after they buy a property. And that letter will give them the opportunity to explain, hey, there was something unique. There's a questionnaire that goes out so that for assessment purposes, they can kind of qualify what happened there. Now, because they were buying it below market, you know, maybe they don't want to say that for assessment purposes. Maybe they end up representing that was an arm's length transaction. But as far as MLS, I would just kind of put a note in there. Not necessarily have to narrate the whole thing, but just something that, you know, tells appraisers and other folks, hey, here's what was wonky on this deal.
Awesome. All right. We got another question here. All right, Diane B.
What do I unmute here?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have two questions. The first question is, I missed some of the insurance business. Do we have to continue our homeowners insurance throughout this entire process? Or can we just, my insurance is up December 15th or whatever. Do I continue to keep that policy or do I just take liability?
I would recommend you keep your policy. It depends on a couple of scenarios. So if it's flood insurance, that's potentially 50-50, depending on if it's a total loss payout. But if you have a lender, your lender would require it. So if there's no lender in place, the flood insurance is again, I would say 50-50 as whether you keep it or not. The homeowner's insurance, though, what I would recommend doing is going in, if you're debating whether or not to keep it, go in and remove some of the coverages, try to get the policy whittled down to as basic coverage as you can, but still maintain the policy. Because in a lot of situations, you will not be able to find another policy for that house. If you do make repairs and renovations to the home, it will be very, very difficult. And you may not be able to get it as affordable as it currently is.
Right. Yeah, I guess my question is, do I have to keep it to get paid from the insurance if this goes into January, February, March, and
You do
April?
not. You do not. So the policy that was in place at the time of the loss, that it doesn't matter. You could miss the payment the next day as long as the coverage was in force at the time of the loss. Then you have coverage.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. My other question is, FEMA came in with a inspector. She didn't take pictures. She didn't do anything. And they've come up with a figure of just say $26,000 for repairs. I honestly don't feel that the house can be repaired. We had 36 inches of water in the house and everything pretty much at that level is destroyed. I've checked into having it dried out and we don't even have electric yet. And just to get it dried out, have an electrical pedestal or whatever put in is going to run almost that amount of money.
So just to clarify, the FEMA inspector that came in was not your flood adjuster, correct?
No, I don't have flood insurance.
Okay. Yeah, so FEMA, just so everybody's aware, if you file for a FEMA assistance, they send out their own inspector as if, just like an insurance company does. They send out their own adjuster or inspector, and then they come up with a valuation. And if you had 3 feet of water, every single person that had any water in their house like that, maybe even if it's a foot, should file for the FEMA program. But as far as their assessment, I'm sure there's ways to counter that assessment or to show that their evaluation was, again, they came in, I know the experience because I saw it done. They don't take any pictures. They walk around with an iPad and they like click a couple buttons and ask you a few questions, and then somehow they magically come up with this valuation of what your damage is. It's hokey pokey. It really is. So there's a way where you can apply, I'm sure, hey, here, look, I just had some assessments for my damage in my house, probably utilizing a contractor for the cost of repairs. If you could get a contractor statement, an estimate of what the cost for repairs are, then you could send that into FEMA and say, hey, this is that I know your assessment was 26,000, but this is the real life cost. Here's the real number. And then they can probably make some modifications. The other thing too in that assessment is, I don't know exactly, I'm not versed in FEMA like you would think I would be, but again, it's not insurance. So, it's a government aid program, but they also include things in there for displacement, for like the things you're dealing with, electric and HVAC, some of those facilities that service your house. And they include a cost or evaluation for displacement of that for you to go live somewhere else temporarily. And so not even the cost of repairs, but factoring that in is another way to boost what they are, looking at as a total loss. I mean, frankly, you're not to discourage you, but you're probably a year from repairs. It's being completed, maybe more. And so you're displaced for a year, and just the cost of rent alone would maybe exceed that 26,000 that they came up with. So there's a couple angles there I'm sure you can take. I don't know exactly how to tell you to navigate through that, but maybe some ideas there.
Yeah, no, that was a great question. And then I think we have one more, and then I have a question too. So it says, Brian, you referenced flood insurance check, taking the check. What about a homeowner's claim check? If, for instance, can the sellers take insurance check and sell as is?
Yeah,
So-
but you won't get the full benefit. You won't get the full value of it, right? So the initial valuation the insurance company is going to do, again, and historically, I've always seen it be low because it doesn't include the inflationary components of a hurricane. They're using a software that just can't factor that in. So typically, if you take that initial offer and sell the property as is, if I were buying your property, knowing what I know, I would say that's fine. You can take the initial offer, but you're still going to assign that policy to me and not close out that claim. And then I will take over that policy and methodically probably get another 50%, maybe another 100% of juice out of that policy, because they inevitably will miss things that you find out later, or that the other thing too is they withhold depreciation. So if your policy has a replacement cost, that's great, but until you actually replace it, they withhold the depreciated value of it. So if you take that initial check and walk, and you had, you got a $50,000 check, if you look at the paper, your total loss is probably 60, 70,000. Then they take your deductible, then they take your depreciation, and then that's the first round of check that you receive. But the depreciation is sitting there. And when you show, hey, I replaced my roof, they release that depreciation that they've had sitting there. So you could be talking about, if you tried to just take your check and walk and then assign the policy, someone else is going to be able to come in and do the repairs and pick up all that depreciation and potentially find other damage that was not previously paid.
And, okay, so interesting. I know we've seen a couple of times from Irma that, these situations have happened. So Linda, I know that was your question. Does that help answer, or do you need to go another layer? Because that's making my mind think. I know you're muted. Let me unmute you. It's very interesting. So what typically is the amount of benefits that could be sitting there that they didn't know about? On average, is there an average number?
No, every claim is unique. but I can tell you, just in my own personal experience, I did purchase a property and I did take over the claim. I also had another situation that I purchased the property and the prior owner did not file. Okay, so imagine buying a property in 2018 post Irma 6 months, and the prior policy owner and property owner did not file a claim. I said, well, I am going to open the claim up and I'm going to have you assign the benefits to me for that claim. And it resulted in, this was in a commercial property, it resulted in about a $35,000 payout. And that's after the deductible was accounted for. That the prior building owner just wasn't going to file a claim. And then in another situation, in purchasing a residential property and just understanding the rules of engagement, right? It's not like I'm taking advantage of a system. I'm just understanding the process. I purchased a residential property. The initial payout was $50,000 to the homeowner, and I acquired the property with cash and was able to get another $100,000 in coverage. So I mean, it could be 20,000, it could be 5,000, it could be hundreds of thousands, right? So when you're dealing with a transaction right now and someone is willing to buy it as is, like an example Brett had, unless that flood policy paid policy limits, if I were the purchasing party, I would still have that flood policy assigned to me, because if it didn't pay policy limits, I may be able to go back as the buyer and dig in a little deeper and say, hey, you paid us 100,000, but we had 200,000 in coverage, and we found another $50,000 of work that you didn't account for on your first pass. So that's something that needs to be done, and I would certainly do it if I were buying the property.
Well, I have a seller. He's gone. He moved back to Indiana. He had it, the roof, brand new roof, kind of leaked. So the back half of the house is, all the sheetrock is ripped out. We're getting offers, of course, low offers. And we're trying to guide him to make a decision. So we're waiting to see what the insurance claim has to offer and how we can proceed. And we're just walking blindly through this. We have no idea where to go or how to handle and help our client.
I mean, so the question is, does the client, the owner of the property, want to stay, figure this out and work through it? If the answer is no.
He's gone.
Okay, so then the answer is no, then, I would say try to find the right buyers that are willing to pay a somewhat fair market value, including the benefit of transferring those policies. And that's the challenge, but that's where you go with it. I don't think in the state that the property's in, also giving the short time frame we've had since Ian, that you're going to be able to get, what maybe the property is truly worth.
But the seller can take that insurance check to help
The
offset
seller
the
can take it, but
mortgage.
that's
And
going to potentially discount the buy. The buyers, if the seller's taking that money off the table, it's going to discount the sale price, because the buyer is going to have to do all those repairs without the insurance proceeds, right? So it's whether you get it from the sale or you're going to get it from the insurance company. But I'm just saying, after that moment, if the buyer is savvy, they will make sure that the policies are assigned to them for future potential insurance proceeds.
okay, but the seller taking that check is not fraud. That's my concern.
No, not at all, because they had an insurable interest in the property, and that's why they had insurance. It's not fraud at all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, real quick, Matt, will you tell, so why would somebody call you, Matt, if they needed to have an appraiser, or what all should they know about you and why they would call you?
I mean, obviously right now, as it relates to what we're talking about, we're doing a ton of 50% private appraisal work. So I spent a lot of time kind of describing how that works and the assessment number that's applicable to it. But I also told you that, yeah, that assessment number is just a starting point. So in a lot of situations, that number doesn't accommodate what people need to pull a permit on in order to get work done. So they do need a private appraisal. We do a ton of that private appraisal work. We did it, well before the storm, and obviously right now, we're doing a lot of it. I've probably had 4 or 5 different things pop up in my inbox since we've been on the line of different new 50% rule issues. So that's on the top of everybody's mind. Again, happy to share any resources also as it relates to that publication 547 and the diminution in value work. We're doing that work also. But what we view ourselves as real estate problem solvers. We do a lot of valuation work, but we also do we're kind of helping some folks who've been impacted navigate in the real estate market, what this means, how to position their properties, strategy, different things to think through. So basically, if it's not a fit for us, we'll point you in the right direction. But yeah, right now, obviously, it's primarily the 50% rule work that's important.
Awesome. And I will say that kudos to Matt. He's helped me on a lot of real estate deals that appraisals came in low, and he's guided me through and helped me save the deals. Sometimes they're savable, sometimes they're not. And so I do give you kudos, and I trust you, and I so appreciate your time. And so thank you. And his number is on the chat so that you can take his information down. And then Brian, by the way, Brian's basically like my brother. I grew up across the street from him, since I was basically born. And so so our family goes back 37, probably 45, 50 years. I don't even know. So besides home insurance, do you also do car insurance, boat insurance? What's important as to what people need to know about you?
Yeah, I mean, any motorized vessel. We have obviously a boating community here, so we will see the same or very similar process with the home insurance. We're going to see that with boats and with vessels, with the amount of damage that happened to those, kind of floating along and landing in people's backyards. And so there'll be marine surveys that'll be required for some of those vessels. Some people are getting a total payout on their boats, but then buying back the salvage of that boat. Most companies, most boat carriers, they consider those a total loss, and they sell them to a third party for usually about 10% of the salvage value, just to recoup some of the insurance losses. But then sometimes the person that lost that recreational item can purchase it back. You can also do it with vehicles. I don't know why somebody would want to purchase an auto back that's been flooded, but there are things that take place there. Golf carts, just a lot of things that you would never think about that were damaged through this, and it touches just about everything, especially Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel. But one thing, there's a lot of questions on the public adjuster. A lot of people are curious, what is a public adjuster? So I just wanted to answer that if we have a minute. And then one other thing on condo units. So a public adjuster is a third party. It's not your insurance adjuster from your carrier. Public adjuster is somebody you would retain kind of counsel, but they're not typically an attorney. They have a licensing through the state of Florida. They have their own public adjuster licensing platform that they work with. Typically, I would recommend, at the very least, waiting for your initial offer before you retain a public adjuster. If that's not an option for you, or you're just not willing to take on the challenge, then you can hire a public adjuster. Their contracts start at 10%. It's a state statute on that number. Those are negotiable. I always tell people that it's just like any contract, you can negotiate the terms of it. They're frowned upon a little bit by the insurance carriers, obvious reasons there. But the one thing I can tell you is it will make the process probably a little bit longer. if you hire a public adjuster. Second thing I can tell you is they are tagged at the carriers. So if you hire a public adjuster, they go into a different silo within the claims process at the carriers because they treat them differently. So, you know, they put a PA number on it, on that claim, so that they know which ones have a public adjuster and which ones don't. Some make out better, some make out the same, and some, if they choose the wrong public adjuster, don't make out as well as they could have on their own. So it's kind of like hiring a contractor. You got to know who you're getting in bed with. The condo units, for any one of your clients that are buying a condo unit right now, this is very, very important. Most condo associations will have an assessment in the future, and that assessment will be paid by the condo unit owners themselves.
Mhm.
So when you close a real estate transaction on a condo unit right now, and you know, the understanding is that there was some damage, but it's going to be fixed, inevitably there's going to be additional cost that is not insured that association is going to face.
Mm.
And once they deplete their reserves and, you know, maybe take a temporary loan, the association will not be in the same financial shape that it was prior to Ian. And what's going to happen in that situation is the association is going to assess, formal assessment to the unit owners. And that assessment will be paid by the current owner. It does not go backwards. So if you sell a condo unit next 30 days, and then an assessment happens 6 months from now, the date of the loss is the date of the assessment. So it's a claim, but it's based off the date that the assessment is done. It does not go back to Ian. So, you know, Ian was the date, September 28th. We'll know that day for probably ever. But if an assessment happens next year in July, that's the date of the loss for the current unit owner. So what my suggestion is potentially have a separate escrow arrangement at the closing where the seller agrees to fund that future assessment, even if it's $2,000 or something like that. Come up with that, put it in there, you know, maybe put something in writing where it's a 24-month account that lives for 2 years. And then at the end of that, whether there was an assessment or not, the buyer, the current owner, gets to keep that. I think that would make it probably simple versus having to go back to the seller. But most associations, most in Southwest Florida, will have an assessment. Particularly the landscape losses, the carport losses, a lot of the things, the parking lot lighting, all of those things are very difficult to find insurance for, and the associations will be having to fix those out of pocket. So just caution, know that if you're selling a condo unit, there's probably going to be assessments in the future.
Oh, well, I think we just opened up a can of worms to talk about next week. Well, that's very, I'm glad that you covered that before we ended, because wow, that's important. And I'm sure Brett's already looking into it, and I know I am. So again, thank you so much, Matt and Brian, for being on for the last hour and a half and your knowledge and wisdom. And Brian, if you could text your information to the box real quick before we leave, that way everyone's got your information. And this is recorded, and so if anyone needs a copy of it, I'll be happy to send that out. And my email, I'll put it in there too. By the way, I'm Morgan Grimes. I'm not Denny Grimes. I know it says Denny Grimes on there, but I'm Morgan Grimes. I forgot to introduce myself. And then there's my email. Awesome. So have a great day. And again, thank you so much, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.